I'm Jacqueline Goldstein, curator at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, and we're going to now start with the Will Eisner virtual tour of our exhibition. Will Eisner, illustrator and innovator. And today we have very special guest star, Denis Kitchen, cartoonist, founder and publisher of Kitchen Sink Press, is going to be with us today walking through the exhibition. He knew Will Eisner for many years, published for him, and we're ready to go. Denis, welcome.
Thank you, Jackie. I wish I was in Florida right now enjoying your weather, but we'll do the virtual tour from Massachusetts.
Okay. Let me ask you, before we start, give our viewers just a quick overview of your career. How did you start and how did you get to it?
Yeah, I started in the late 1960s as what's known as an underground cartoonist during the that hippie movement, the anti-war movement. I was a self-published cartoonist who quickly evolved into being a publisher of other cartoonist work. And that's how Kitchen Sink Press came to be. In 1971, I had the pleasure of meeting Will Eisner, and even though he was 30 or so years older than me, we immediately hit it off by a common passion in comics. At that time, comics were still not taken all that seriously by the general culture, but Will always believed in it from his earliest years. And as the market changed and press like mine was able to adapt to the new growing fandom and serious scholarship about comics, we joined forces for many years.
Excellent. So we're very, very happy to have you along on our tour today. Giving it over. Let me do a shared screen right now and we can get started with the running comment. Okay, I need to, Nancy, be able to share a screen. I don't know why it's not allowing me. Hold on. Nancy, are you there? Okay, hold on. Okay. Try this one more time. Here we go. The logistics. Okay, so welcome to the exhibition. This is with us right now at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU in Miami Beach, Florida. And let's get started. We're going to start with The Spirit, Eisner's comic. Denis, let's hear from you.
Sure. The Spirit was a very unusual feature. It was not a comic book. It was a comic-like insert that was inserted in subscribing newspapers, the same way if you got a newspaper today and there's a weekly magazine type insert, that's what The Spirit was. It was a 16-page full color insert that came with your paper. And The Spirit allowed Will to be very innovative. There were no rules. He was with a small syndicate that basically let him do whatever he wanted. And so The Spirit, every week he churned out 7 pages, of which this particular one is called Gerhard Schnabel. And this happened to be Will's favorite Spirit story. It involved a little man named Gerhard Schnabel who could fly, but he never was able to demonstrate it. And in this story, you see here the first 4 pages. The first one is what we call a splash page. The second one is smaller. It's actually because that's a photograph that Will put balloons on. That was very, very unusual. So basically, the Spirit in this case, he's normally a seemingly dead detective who actually survived and wears a mask so that he's ostensibly unknown to society. He plays a minor role, as he often did in these stories, because Will was really just a storyteller at heart, and The Spirit was an excuse for the story. In this one, if you move to the next tier where we have the final 3 pages, you'll see that in the concluding pages here, The Spirit is involved in a shootout with thugs at the top of a building, a very tall building in New York City, when Gerhard Schnabel finally is demonstrating to the world that he can fly, but he gets caught in a crossfire and he's killed and drops to the ground. So no one ever knew he really could fly. So it's a tragic comic story that Will always said was his favorite, although there were so many. He did literally hundreds of these stories, and a number of them, arguably could have been his favorite, but I selected this one for the show because of that. What's especially nice too, if you look at the page on the furthest left, there's a wonderful vertiginous panel where you see Gerhard plunging.
Right, this one right here, right?
Yeah, it's a terrific tour de force of drawing and making the reader hopefully feel a little bit dizzy.
It definitely achieves that. Why do you think he felt like it was his favorite? I know the Spirit ran all the way from 40 to 1952 with the break
Yeah,
of the war. Why do you think?
I'm not sure. It's a sentimental story, and I think at heart, Will was a sentimentalist. And I think also because it was a human story and it wasn't about cops and robbers and, treasures and beautiful femme fatales or many of the other things that dominated the stories. It was just about a guy who was misunderstood. And I think for him, perhaps metaphoric.
Metaphoric, right? A quick background. Eisner was born in 1917 in my hometown of New York City. And he went to DeWitt Clinton High School, which is actually a very interesting school for comics because Bob Kane also went there, who was the creator of Batman. So I wonder what was happening up in DeWitt Clinton, that's where Eisner had his first, I guess, cartoon experience illustrating for the school newspaper. Is that right?
I think school magazine and yearbook, yes. I think DeWitt Clinton specialized in creative students, those with interest in drawing, acting, music. So it was one of those wonderful things, unique perhaps to New York City at that point in time. So here we are with a short story he created called Humans. This is basically cavemen. Will often focused on stories about Neanderthals and cavemen. He was fascinated both by human history, but also just the origins of thinking. And so I can't remember where this story appeared offhand. It was during his graphic novel stage later on, probably the 1980s or 90s. And you'll see it's also not typical in that there are no typical balloons with the dialogue. In this case, the dialogue is in text and then it's illustrated. So it's more of a quasi-comic, more in the style of, say, Prince Valiant, if you recall, where there were never voice balloons per se, but everything was told in a running text dialogue. So that makes this one unusual. And also that it shows that Will was doing far more than just heroic adventures, which the Spirit was.
We'll push this back 1 second. Heroic adventures, yeah. It's back there. This is on timesmanship, but I'm pulling us back to where we wanted to be a minute ago. Okay, so here we are. And I'm
Yeah, untimesmanship is
previous, but how was this different? I really enjoyed looking at the Neanderthals comic books.
right. I think that
Neanderthals making comics in a cave. This
right.
is great.
Yes, I'm glad you juxtaposed those because Will often used Neanderthals as kind of a stand-in for the origins of comics. Comics are, after all, only the combination of words and pictures. And while we think of comics as a fairly modern invention going back to the 1890s or perhaps the 1840s, depending on your viewpoint, Will thought that they went back much further and that the drawings on cave walls actually typify the earliest humans' attempts to communicate. And for Will, that's what it was all about. An artist paints pictures that should communicate something to you, and writers obviously write text. Cartoonists use both, and Will was among the best there ever was at it, but he also was curious about its origins. And so for him, going back to the earliest known recordings of humans, the cave drawings,
Mhm.
he used that as an example of how we've always been communicating through words and pictures. Of course, hieroglyphics would be another example. Some would say the Bayeux tapestry. You can go on and on for examples until we get to what we call the modern comic, which in America evolved in the 1890s in newspaper supplements, typified by things like the Yellow Kid, the Katzenjammer Kids, and so on, and then comic books, which evolved in the mid 1930s. And then with Will, starting in 1978, the modern graphic novel, which is basically a book but told in words and pictures. And that's become quite phenomenally popular in the last few decades.
Absolutely, especially with Art Spiegelman's Mouse.
It certainly was a big pivotal point, yes.
So here we are now with On Timesmanship.
Okay. So this is part of, there were a couple of books that Will did that were what I'd call short vignettes about life in the city. And in this case, you have a wordless story. So when I said just a minute ago, the comics were a combination of words and pictures, sometimes they can just be sequential pictures, as in the case of On Timesmanship. So what you have here is, we can zero back in. You have a moment where you
Trying to get us closer. Here we go. Okay.
sure.
That's it.
So you have, in this case, a typical example of somebody's alarm going off and they have to get up and get ready to go to work. This was, of course, pre-pandemic, where people had to get up and take the subway into New York's high rise of some sort. And so if you look at this one, the pictures one by one tell the story of this particular harried fellow who has to get up, brush his teeth, wash, shave, rush out the door, and then deal with the rush of humanity. And so the whole thing is quite, I would say, claustrophobic, because Will puts you in a situation where you feel this fellow squeezing himself, into a subway, squeezing himself into an escalator, squeezing himself into an elevator. And finally, if you can go to the final page, I think this is a, 7-page, 8-page story. So in the final panel, you see, can we get a close-up?
Let's try to get closer to there. How is that?
Right. And so I'm trying to recall the punchline here is he's getting out of a cab, and I don't know if your viewer can quite see what's going on here, as he's basically stalled in a classic New York traffic jam. It's basically a vignette about living in a big city that's crowded with people and everybody's in a hurry, at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, all trying to get to their little cubicle so they can begin their workday. And then, of course, it all happens in reverse, leaving and getting back on the same crowded subway and traffic jam. So for Will, this is one of a few dozen stories he did about little snippets of life in the big city. Will was a native New Yorker. He lived there most of his life until he and his wife Ann moved to Florida. And he loved the city and he loved every bit about it, even things like this that would drive most people crazy. To him, it was a subject for satire, for observation of, the human spirit. And in this case, uh, beating the daily deadline that almost everybody has to endure.
Absolutely. This is back
This-
to the spirit. This is the river of crime. This is
Yeah, this is toward the end of Will's life. He did 3 large serigraphs, which are silk screens that he signed limited numbers of. So it's based on one of the classic splash pages, one of the splash meaning the opening dramatic page of a 7-page spirit story. So this one is wonderful in that you have a worm's eye view of the spirit walking along a dark street, and you have a sewer, in which case the spirit logo, which changed every story. Here you see the SPIRIT slowly washing down the drain, literally into a sewer with the opening words of the chapter. And Will seemed consciously or subconsciously obsessed with water. In so many of his stories, we see torrential downpours, we see like this sewers, we see oceanfront scenes with docks, we see just scenes of water constantly. And a colleague of Will's, Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad Magazine, at one point coined a term for this, a Yiddish sounding word called Eisenspritz. And so whenever I see a lot of water in one of Will's pictures, I think it's a perfect example of Eisenspritz. And he returned to it over and over again. Later, he did a book actually on astrology, and someone he worked with pointed out that he was a Pisces, and so of course he was obsessed with water. And if you believe in astrology, I suppose you could say it was fated, but I would prefer to call it a coincidence. But in any event, this is a beautiful piece that kind of exemplifies the mood that Will would put into his stories. Oftentimes, nighttime scenes with dramatic lighting. Will was a master of shadows. These night street lamps being the only source of light here. The hydrant is another example of just the city detail that Will loved drawing. Even way down in the bottom right-hand corner, you see discarded matchbook. It's just a classic example of Will giving you a point of view that's unusual and dramatic, something that most artists would be, honestly, afraid to attempt. But Will was always thinking out of the box.
this is Dropsy Avenue. I mean, this is, the story of all these different immigrants in one neighborhood in Bronx, which is really interesting. I really took to this series, and really Will Eisner is one of my, favorite cartoonists, because coming from a family of immigrants growing up in New York City, this spoke to me so much, especially my father's family growing up in the Bronx with everybody from the Jews, the Irish, the Italians, everybody living on the same block. And my grandmother used to share all these recipes. And I grew up with the best Southern fried chicken, the best, meatballs cooking all day. All that stuff is what I grew up with, even though my father's family was Hungarian. They came in the early 40s,
Sure.
So what can you tell me about the
Well,
Avenue?
as you suggest, Will grew up in a similar neighborhood, a classic New York melting pot. And so he wanted to tell the story about how New York evolved ethnically, starting from the very first Dutch settlers, and then the British, and then the Irish, and so on. Each time a new wave of immigrants came in, the existing residents would resent it to some degree. The neighborhood would change, and then a new influx would come in. And he took it right up to the present, where the same neighborhood he had grown up with was increasingly Puerto Rican and African American. So it's really unusual in that instead of the story of any individual heroes, it's really the biography of a neighborhood. And with each passing generation, you see representative residents and you get a short glimpse of their own life and interaction. But the only continuing element throughout is the neighborhood itself. And in these particular originals, we have the final ink page next to the pencil concept drawing. So I think for those visitors to the museum who are not really familiar with how cartoonists work, this gives you an idea how typically it's done. Will on the right here would do what we call a tight pencil composition. So yeah, if you could even close in on that a bit more, the essential story on the right is roughed in with the dialogue, the basic placement of the characters, the basic action, and then Will would use that for the final inking. And you can see there are subtle changes, like the lower left corner, for example. In the first version, the fellow in the derby hat is looking more directly at the reader. In the final version, he's looking more directly at the character he's threatening. And so that would have been a last minute change where Will thought, for whatever reason, this might be a more dramatic way to tell that story or to balance the page. But it's 90% there. And for Will, usually his first thought was the thought he stuck with. But I wanted your viewers to be able to see the working process, which normally you would never see because you buy the book, you see the finished version, of course.
Right. Let's run over to World War II. I know that Eisner was drafted into the army in World War II, and because of his illustration, his cartoonist abilities, he began making these pamphlets for the new soldiers to learn, I guess, how to use the equipment in a language they can understand, really. So, and it continued, right, throughout the war and even after the war, he kept making these manuals.
Yeah, actually, the manuals did come later. These are actually posters, instructional posters that would have been hung up in barracks. That's why they're so large. This is the size roughly they would have been reproduced. They're unusual too, in the sense that you see Will here, who was serving as a warrant officer in the Pentagon, was using humor to basically instruct soldiers mainly on how to take care of the equipment. The top one, the type is missing, but in that black oblong, there would have been a message just like the one on the bottom, which basically is telling you how to take care of your equipment. The top one, obviously, this fellow, Joe Dope, who is kind of a stand-in for, let's just say, a less intelligent soldier. He's obviously fired his machine gun a little bit too closely to the other fellow and literally chopped the guy's belt off, apparently, so it's dropped. So this was a way to get the soldiers to first laugh at the humor, but then hopefully to digest the message. Will then utilize this, as you say, a little bit later in instructional manuals, which he pioneered. Prior to this, the Army had been using what we'd call old-fashioned text with poor illustrations or poor photographs, and they were not very effective. Will had to convince his superiors that a cartoon approach would be the most effective, and they were skeptical. So they did a study, I'm told, at the University of Chicago, where they had test groups looking at the old manuals and what Will proposed, and they found the cartoon manuals were much more effective in terms of retaining information. And so the brass at the Pentagon quickly greenlit the cartoon version, and it was called Army Motors. And then after the war and after Will was discharged, he continued doing it as a private citizen called PS Magazine, which was a preventive maintenance magazine that continues to this day. but Will worked on it from roughly 1950 until the 1970s with a staff. And so his relationship with the Army lasted literally 30 years or so.
Wow. Wow. So anybody coming in later, by the way, I want to be able to let you know to come back and see the exhibit. You can click on my data points, which will pull you up and give you more information at your own leisure. But anyway, the name of the game, and this was basically the story of his wife Anne's three-generational family story. What can you tell us about her family? What what did he base this on? I mean, we're looking at tuxedos here. We're looking at.
Well, first of all, I should say Will, first of all, tapped his own family in several autobiographical and semi-autobiographical pieces, starting with Contract with God, and Heart of the Storm was the most overtly autobiographical of his material. And after he ran out of things to say about his own family, he then turned to Anne's, who had a fascinating story of her own. Will's parents came over on a boat, literally, but Anne's parents had been in America for several generations. They came over, I forget when, but very early on. They actually were involved in business in Indiana, I think making girdles, and eventually moved back east to New York. Her father was a stockbroker. And so this is a story basically of the origins of her family and how her father and her stepmother, well, I should backtrack. It's really, Will weaves himself into this one too, because Anne is in the story, both as a young girl who is at one point kidnapped by her father when her parents are separated. And
did that really happen?
It really happened. Yeah, I thought that was a fictional element that Will might have put in, but no, she said that was true. And so she's depicted as a young girl with a different name, Rosie, I believe. And then as she grows up, she falls in love with a poet. The poet is at that point a stand-in for Will. He didn't want to make it too overtly autobiographical, but
some artist, some starving artist. Okay.
Exactly. So in real life, her father, the stockbroker, did approve of the marriage to Will, but he thought that cartooning was not the most respectable profession. And so he invited Will to join his brokerage firm. And Will graciously declined and, as we know, continued in his less respectable career. But in this story, the fictional element that Will inserts is that the poet does accept the invitation, and then he turns into a real bastard and an awful husband and an awful person. And so to me, it's Will's way of showing a what if. How would my life have changed if I had taken the invitation of Anne's father and gotten into a kind of it might have been a cutthroat business that would have changed my personality. So I think it's fascinating that Will showed that what if. Right. But probably 80% of this book is actually Anne's story.
There's two more pieces from it. So he moved to Florida, and Sunset and Sunshine City. This was also continuation of his autobiographical. Why the move to Florida?
Well, honestly, I think they just got tired of shoveling snow in White Plains, New York, and the weather. I think Will no longer had to be in New York. For many years, when he did the PS magazine and had a commercial studio and other business, he needed to go to his studio in New York City, where he had a number of employees. But when he ended that and he began focusing on graphic novels, they realized he could do that anywhere. And I think they just decided Florida was a more comfortable place for them to live. And so this story is a fictional story about someone who also sells his business and decides to leave and move to New York. It doesn't really parallel Will and Ann's life, but it's inspired, I think, by people they met when they moved to New York, to Florida. Many of them were ex-New Yorkers or snowbirds who were in Florida a good part of the year. And so in this case, it's about a widower who moves to New York and eventually meets someone and has a fling with her and an adventure. So it's a fictional story, but inspired by their move.
I can bring you over to. Let's try to get closer to this right now. Speaking of autobiographical. So this is basically, as an autobiographical, the story of his life, the son of immigrants, like many of us were, and tenement life and growing up, basically, I don't want to say poor, but lower income. One of the reasons I know that he basically got into comics was he was selling newspapers right on Wall Street.
That's right.
Trying to bring home a little bit of extra cash.
Right. During the Great Depression, Will's father had a tough time often keeping a job or making a decent living. And so as soon as Will was a teenager, he had to contribute to the family income. He was the oldest of 3 children. And so, yeah, he started as a newspaper boy. Early on, too, he developed his artistic skills, although there was a conflict there because Will's father essentially was a failed artist. He did backdrops for the Yiddish theater, for example, and wanted to paint and wanted to be creative, but it never was really something he could make a living at. And so when Will started to show an aptitude for drawing, Will's mother was not supportive at all. She basically said, don't be like your father. You can't, really take care of this family. Do something better, go into business, make something of yourself. And so Will struggled between his father's encouragement and his mother's discouragement. And obviously we know he stuck with art and he was very successful. So he made both of them happy. But this is really a multi-generational story, not only of Will's family from his from the roots in Austria to right up to his adulthood. It really is a story of the family's experiences with anti-Semitism. That's the thread that runs alongside all of the stories he tells. And it's him coming to grips with the fact that, yes, he had a lot of opportunity and he made something of himself, but it also reveals how there were impediments at various steps, and how, for example, someone who he thought was his closest childhood friend turned out to be an anti-Semite, something that kind of broke his heart. So he tells this story, his parents' story, grandparents, in a very touching way. Works on multiple levels.
It's amazing. Unfortunately, we had to keep this short. We are out of time, Dennis, but I'd like to, this is only a small portion of the exhibit. I really recommend people to be coming back using, these data points here. And if I can show you these white circles, if you just click on them, they take you anywhere you want to go into the gallery, such as here, and then come back at your own leisure. It'll be up on our website shortly, which is jmof.fiu.edu. And Dennis, I hope to get you back on and talk some more. It's really, really exciting.
No, it's a pleasure. I appreciate the chance to walk through this with you, Jacqueline, and I hope circumstances allow a lot of people to do an actual walkthrough who live in your area.
Oh yeah, we were only to show in this small amount of time today, a little bit, but it's really a pleasure having you on.
Thank you. And I hope some of the readers or viewers will actually pick up some of the books too, because that's the best way to appreciate Will.
Let me just quickly show some of the books that we have on display. He had, many graphic novels. The first, The Contract of God. I wish I could keep going. 1978, basically the first graphic novel. If I can find it where it is.
On the right, no, I'm sorry. Yeah, the left corner, there you're on it. It's, scholars will argue about what the first graphic novel is, but one thing we can agree on is The Contract with God was the first that really changed things. There were at least a couple of precursors that were failures in the marketplace, but Will's was the first one that gained traction and inspired dozens and then hundreds of other artists to follow suit. And now we have an entire genre that happened because Contract with God came in 1978. So it's a good one to start with, but they're all self-contained, and your customers can jump in any of them comfortably.
Absolutely. Okay. And one last thing, if anybody wants some more information about Denis Kitchen, it's Deniskitchen.com. Is that what the website is?
That's right. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. My pleasure. All right. Well, that's all we have today. Thank you so
All right.
much for joining us
You bet.
for the Will Eisner tour from the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. And thank you so much, Denis.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Bye-bye.
Bye.